Good afternoon, everyone. Thank you so much for joining me this week. I thought, because we have so many new faces in this community, and many of you have told me that you have young kids, I thought maybe I would spend a few minutes today talking about something that is like the one thing that I feel a little qualified to be able to talk about. So for those of you who don't know me, I'm Kiyah Duffey. I have a PhD in nutritional epidemiology, and for the last 20 or so years have been doing research on how we can help our kids have healthier relationships with food. My research itself has really started and was focused on dietary patterns and trying to understand how what we eat is related to things like weight gain and obesity, and in particular cardiometabolic disease, so heart disease and diabetes. And when I had kids, I realized that all of this work I had been doing with adults to try to understand what they were eating and help them make different decisions and have a healthier, more positive relationship with food, that I had an opportunity with my own kids to help them get started on that positive relationship with food from the moment they started eating with me. Rather than, as I was finding with many of the adults that I was working with, and even frankly with myself, trying to change habits that we had formed throughout our childhood, adolescence, and young adulthood, and trying to then make changes to those habits. And as we all know, making changes to the habits that we have is very difficult. So if I could get my kids started on a more positive trajectory, I thought maybe all the better for them. And so I started doing as much research as I could around what we know helps kids develop positive relationships with food and healthy eating habits. And there are a couple of things that I have learned through that research and things that I have really tried to implement in my own home. So the thing that I realized in doing a lot of research is that when babies are born, and I've talked about this before, when babies are born, they have an innate ability to listen to their internal signals of hunger and fullness. There, in fact, is at least one study that was done that looked at letting kids eat until they were full, and it measured their basal metabolic rate, or the amount of energy that they needed just to sustain life. And they let these infants eat until they were full and eat when they were hungry and stop when they were full. And they ate to within a few calories of their basal metabolic needs. Their ability to understand what they need is so finely tuned. And what ends up happening when we start feeding our kids, especially when they start eating solid foods and they join us at the table, or they're sitting in their high chair and we start feeding them solid foods, we are really bad at reading their signals of fullness, especially. And so we are very well intentioned. We're hearing lots of different voices. We're getting advice from our moms, our grandmas, our best friends, our partners, our pediatricians are all giving us advice about what we should and shouldn't be doing. And we get worried about our kids growing and developing in the way that they should. And we often end up overfeeding because we aren't great at reading their signals of fullness, and because we love them, worried. We end up overfeeding our kids. And over time, because they are listening to our signals instead of their internal signals, they end up overeating. So the more you can do to let your kids feed themselves and retain control over that process of how much they eat, the more likely it is that they will retain their ability to listen to those signals of their internal signals of fullness, and they will be less likely to overeat over time. Where this kind of gets thrown off, and a particularly challenging time for letting our kids continue to feed themselves, is when they start eating solid foods. For a couple of reasons. One, because it is messy. If you have a little kid that has gone through transitioning from breast and bottle feeding into solid foods, you know it is messy. They do not have the motor development that they need in order to be able to feed themselves really well, and they make a mess. Also, eating with all of their senses is really important for them, and so they make a mess in part because that's partly how they're learning. So they end up making a mess. So because we don't want to take time, or we don't have time, or we just don't want the mess, we end up feeding our kids to keep it cleaner. The other thing that happens, which I just described, which is that we are concerned that they are not eating enough, or maybe eating too much, or not eating enough of the right foods. Whatever our concerns are, they come in a variety of shapes and forms. We often end up wanting to have more control over that process. Again, because we care, because we are concerned. So it's messy. We're concerned about the way that they're eating. We're listening to all those other messages that are coming. We end up feeding our kids. And again, over time, they listen to their internal signals they begin having a harder time hearing their internal signals of fullness, and instead they start listening to us. That mealtime, it's time to start or it's time to end. And this is why I started Kizingo specifically. Because when kids are beginning to eat, I don't have a spoon, but here's a pen. They hold their spoons with their palm down. And what they do when they're doing this, again, because their motor skills are not fully developed, they have to make the scooping motion, and then they twist kind of their whole arm like this to get it in, or they tip the spoon like this. And again, all of that ends up making a mess. And the spoons that we designed are shaped differently to make it easier for this motion that kids naturally want to make, for them to be successful getting the food into their mouths, so that they feel confident, they feel excited, and they can do it themselves. There's less mess, right? For us to clean up, because they are actually getting the food into their mouths instead of spilling it everywhere. And we can feel more confident turning that back over to feeding that, and turn that process of feeding themselves back over to our kids. So you absolutely do not need a Kizingo spoon in order for your kids to develop positive relationships with eating. There are lots of other kinds of spoons, especially when they're beginning to eat. Dipper spoons, right? Those really, they're called pre-spoons, where all they need to do is dip it into a liquid in order to, or a viscous material, yogurt, applesauce, for it to stick on the spoon. And then, there's not the scooping action that's needed. There are so many products out there on the market. If it helps you to feel more confident and more secure letting your kids feed themselves, try some of these products. If you are willing to let it be messy and to let them use their hands, that's great too. But there is a lot of evidence that letting kids feed themselves is one of the things that we can do to help them develop positive and healthy relationships with food. And so whatever the conditions are that you need to have in your home to let that be something that your kids get to experience, I highly encourage you to try it. All right, that's it for today. I'm so excited to talk to you all again next week. Drop a line, let me know what questions you have, pop over into the community and let me know what questions you have there. Talk to the community about questions or concerns you have, or just let us know what wins you've had this week, because we want to share in all of that greatness with you.